So girls, have you ever wondered why you might feel a little bit more hungry and a little bit heavier towards the end of your cycle just before you get your period? Well, a lot of this is to actually do with the interplay between our sex hormones and insulin. And so essentially, just as a background, what's going to happen during our cycle, and I won't go too much into the detail because it'll bore you, but essentially the first half of the cycle is called the follicular phase, and this is when our eggs are starting to pump out estrogen. And estrogen is going to start rising in the first half until it reaches a nice peak. And it's the peak of estrogen that's going to help us to actually ovulate an egg. And then estrogen will sort of end up going back down, and then progesterone will actually take over, and progesterone will start rising. And so essentially it will be progesterone that will rise in the latter half, which is called the luteal phase. And then eventually, if we have not had implantation occur, so we haven't had sex and we didn't become pregnant, then the progesterone will drop back down, and this is when we'll be able to have our period. But what's really interesting about these hormones is they do have a really strong relationship with insulin. So as you can imagine, if the body's assuming that we might become pregnant, it's going to want to hold on to a lot more body fat in prep for that. And so if we imagine, it makes sense then why certain things will come into play with our hormones and how they have a relationship with our fat storage hormone, insulin. So when it comes to the interplay between our sex hormones and insulin, it's really fascinating. What you actually see in the first half of the cycle, as I said, is you're going to have more estrogen. Now, the fascinating thing about estrogen is it actually makes us way more insulin sensitive. So this just means that it's going to actually mimic what insulin does at the cells. So insulin's biggest job essentially is to help us to actually bring glucose into the cell so that we can bring that glucose in, break it down, and make energy from it. And what's really interesting about estrogen is it's actually going to bind onto similar receptors on the cell and actually turn on the same cascade like AMPK and things like that within the cell that are going to actually mimic insulin's job. So it's going to help us to become way more insulin sensitive at the cell. And in fact, for this reason, it's actually much more of a fat burning hormone. It's going to help us to break down energy and pull it into the cell so we can make energy. In contrast to this, progesterone actually does the opposite. So progesterone is going to actually inhibit parts of this process. So like AMPK within the cell, it's going to actually make the cell a little bit more insulin resistant. And this makes complete sense because, as I said before, our body is assuming that we may become pregnant. So it's going to start preparing for that. And it will therefore like to try to store on a little bit more body fat so that we will be able to sustain a pregnancy and also sustain breastfeeding to be able to nourish the baby. Think about the actions of insulin. Insulin wants to make us store body fat. So if we can become a little bit more insulin resistant at the cells, then of course we have to release out way more insulin to get its job done. And so it makes sense why if progesterone is making us way more insulin resistant, then we release out more insulin. This is going to make us store more body fat and break less down. As I said, if we are really insulin sensitive as caused by estrogens, then of course we only need like a little tiny trickle of insulin to do its job, and we don't need excessive amounts, and it's not going to make us store as much fat. So interestingly enough, when we become insulin resistant, we also experience more hunger. And that's because another job of insulin essentially is to go to the brain and say, hey, listen, we've just had a meal, we're all good, we don't need to keep eating. But of course, if we're resistant to that insulin, then our hypothalamus is not going to get this signal, and therefore we get more hunger